Welcome back, Rabbi Dr. Eliezerbrodt. We forge along season 2 on the Sfarim of Reb Chaim Kanievsky. We've been discussing, I guess, call it a tangent, somewhat of a tangent, but it's all to really understand where Reb Chaim Kanievsky was coming from. And he was using new manuscripts. So we've been discussing the history of new manuscripts of Rishonim, who have been using them, when have they been coming out. But I think now you ended off discussing the Derech and Rav Kook. I think you'll pick up from there. But I think this episode is going to be very interesting because we're going to focus on really pinning down the date of when new manuscripts started coming out. And as you filled me in beforehand, we're going to be discussing even more from a halachic perspective. Some of the previous Gedolei HaPoskim in the 1800s already using new manuscripts. We'll be discussing the Chayei Adam and the Orach Shulchan, Pnei Yehoshua, not as a Paisik, but as one of the Gedolei HaMefarshim that's made it through till today, one of the primary Achreinim that are learned in the yeshivas today. And then really to figure out how did this start spreading around Europe. And as Rabbi Brodt has mentioned, the Chidah was a primary example of somebody who brought ideas and Sfarim and learning through Europe. You'll probably tell us other places as well. So that's where we will begin. And I hope you are doing well today. Once again, questions, comments, really how you're enjoying the episodes, things that we could do better. Please email myself, shweidem@ou.org or eliezerbrodt@gmail.com with comments, suggestions, other topics. And as always, sponsorships are available for individual episodes and other topics and ideas as well. As always, season 2 has been dedicated by an anonymous donor, a big supporter, call him a chassid, of Rabbi Dr. Eliezerbrodt. And it is in memory of Moshe Chaim ben Yitzchak David. May his neshama have an aliyah. And without further ado, Rabbi Dr. Eliezerbrodt.
Okay, so first, a few brief things just to finish off from last time. In the previous episodes, we've mentioned that there was a whole discussion about the Ramban, about the Vilna Gaon Shita of how to lay in Kriyas HaTorah versus Chodesh, and then there's a Ramban that they discovered later on. It was only printed Seif Yamav, and maybe he would have changed his mind. So I came across that I've mentioned a few times Rav Tiger, who had a schus of having a close relationship with Rav Chaim Kanievsky, so he's put up on the internet many videos of his conversations with Rav Chaim Kanievsky. I came across a video discussing this topic where you could see how Rav Chaim Kanievsky says, yes, that the Ramban was discovered and everything. It's a cute thing. Once you might not necessarily know what he's talking about, but once you hear the sugya, then you can enjoy the video better. It's cool to see this not relying just on a written, one sentence word from Chaim Kanievsky, him talking about it nicely to him. He's reading it inside the Lashon, the Mishnah Berurah. It's a very cute thing. I could send the link if anyone wants. That's number one. Number two is we discussed at the end. We were discussing about the Netziv in his work of his work on Shultus, which is basically where I would point to a big time starting of Ga'inim being learned and being worked on intensely. We discussed this by Richo. So I said is that afterwards, later on, it's picked up by a series of works, Eitzar Ga'inim, from Bam Levine. I linked back that Bam Levine turns out was a very close Talmud of Rav Kook. Rav Kook connected his relationship with the Netziv. Now, there's other connections. In general, Rav Kook, the Netziv had a tremendous impact on the Netziv. As a matter of fact, one of Rav Kook's first pieces was a defense where someone wrote in a newspaper attacking the Heimek Davar of the Netziv, and Rav Kook wrote a defense in the newspapers to defend his Rebbe, the Netziv. Last week I mentioned a different piece of his where he wrote a biography. It was at the request of the Netziv for a newspaper, for a journal at the time, a 4-page beautiful article where he writes all about the Netziv. And what's interesting is that he was asked to write it by the Netziv, and he knew the Netziv was reading it. So it's he had to make sure that it's accurate. It's very kedai to read. I also could send a PDF of this article. Interesting, that also has a beautiful picture of the Netziv included in the original version of that article. Anyway, so Rav Kook, he has a yeshiva which in one of the things about this yeshiva that he wanted to do was also add this into the curriculum. There's a work called Mamari of Cook, which collects many of his speeches and small works of his. And in there, it's a fascinating thing about how what a yeshiva that he wanted to create. It seems they did create it on some level. I don't know if they ever did it to all the aspects of it. And one of the things is that they're going to learn Bavli, Yerushalmi, Mechilta, Safra, Safriya, Tesefta, V'chol Divrei Kadmeinenu, Ahalchim Uzgalmi, Kufas HaGa'inim, and onwards. And they're going to learn it very intensely. This is clearly, again, with the hashpah of the Netziv. Now, interesting is he had a chavrusa, a Talmud, who was basically a mashgiach in the yeshiva, a tremendous Talmud Chacham. His name was Rabbi Yitzchak Arieli. They learned Shas Be'iyun together. They learned for something like 15, 16 years, a few hours a day. The door was closed, and they learned very carefully together. This Rabbi Yitzchak Arieli, he's famous today for being the grandfather of Rav Asher Arieli. Anyway, he wrote a bunch of svarim, and a lot has been written about him in recent years, especially by Eitam Henkin, Hashem Yinkum Damai, both in English. The original articles are written in Hebrew, and later on they were translated into English. Some versions can even be found online. It also can be found in a book of his that recently just came out. Now, this Rabbi Yitzchak Arieli wrote a Sefer Einayim LaMishpat. He also mentions that one of the things that he was going out of his way to do in his work is to collect the new Rishonim that were not used up till now, that the people didn't have, and they were only just coming out in those years. And he lists amongst them the Meiri, the Arzarua, Shidnik Nubetzes, Taisis Rosh, etc., etc., the Ravia, the Eshkol. And so we see also the point is it's a connection again with Rav Kook, usage of new Rishonim. Now, so basically, and one last nakuda to all this is last week I was explaining, the Netziv explains what got him so interested. What did he see in the world of the Ga'inim and the Shultas, and why he spent so much time on it, and what his method was. So at the time I mentioned there's an English translation of this Hagdama to the Hagdama of the Netziv to the Shultas, which the Hagdama is found in any Shult, in any Heimek Shela. But there's they pulled it out once and made a small sefer of it, and then I mentioned last week there's an English translation. I forgot at the time that there is a new work that came out less than 5 years ago, it's close to 400 pages, from a Rav Aryeh Cooperman, where he pulled out the Hagdama, this Hagdama Netziv, tons and tons of footnotes, making it much easier to understand, with a beautiful introduction. In the introduction, he says that the Netziv, he points out also, I only found this buried in my room last week, I completely forgot about it, but he also connects the story with the Netziv and Rav Kook. He also throws in something about it, but he says that the Netziv wanted to create that the Ga'inim should start being learned. He says there's very much no impact whatsoever, except, okay, if you want to assume Rav Kook. But as I said, it's not so much about the Rishonim, it's particularly about the Ga'inim, it's everything. It's the whole approach with using new Rishonim, and you could see that already with another Talmud of his, Rebbe Zalman Meltzer, which as I mentioned in earlier episodes, went on and printed and collected, even from manuscript for the first time, some of the works of the Ramban. Anyway, but more than that is, but even with just Ga'inim and Rishonim, we have one of the greatest Talmudim now of the Netziv, Reb Chaim Kanievsky. As I've documented in all these past episodes, he's using everything. He's using the new Rishonim from manuscript. He's using the new Ga'inim from manuscript. As I mentioned in the previous episodes, he's using Gaitzah Ga'inim, he's using Seder of Ammon Gain, Seder of Sadia Gain, etc., etc. So we have over here that it's not only Rav Kook that's going by hashpas of the Netziv. Here we have Rev Chaim Kanievsky from Bnei Brak, mamish going with the approach of the Netziv. Just to throw out there, because to mention one last name, not to go into it, but another person that they link to Volozhin, they link him to being a Talmud of the Netziv, but it's still, I didn't see proof of such a thing, although I believe it's true, is Rabbi Yerucham Fisher Perlau. In 1914 to 1917, the entire world was shocked when this massive work comes out on a small little Chibur Sefer HaMitzvos of Rav Sadia Gaon that had been printed earlier. This person puts out a few thousand pages on this work that's just a few lines. How he pulled it off is mind-boggling, and he also uses everything. First, you see him making an intense pirish on Gaonic work of Rav Sadia Gaon, but more than that, he's using everything. He's again using all the Rishonim, the new Rishonim, everything. He's on top of the field completely, and he was a unique individual. But anyway, those are just some brief additions to the previous episodes. Okay, now we're going to get to pretty much to the story, to continue our story of today. We had our short introduction, and that is and just to add to the introduction as follows. If we step back and we look back, what do we do up till now? So I showed that not only is Reb Chaim Kanievsky doing it, I said, oh, it's the Mishnah Berurah. I said, let's see, is there precedent earlier than the Mishnah Berurah? So I showed pretty much that if you look randomly throughout the 1800s, you have Arzarua, Meiri, Rabbeinu Chananel, Sefer HaYashar, Shultus, Ramban, Yereim, all these Sfarim are coming out for the first time, and they're being printed and annotated by Gedolei Olam. More than that, they're being used by Gedolei Olam. We mentioned Rabbi Ephraim Zalman Golis, the Chassam Sofer in Aguna Shaila, the Orach Lener, in a tshuva, he's using the new Tshuvas Hagoyim, and in his journal, etc., etc. We see that it's more than just a side point. It's not like the story, even until today, when you read various articles about it, you'll see, they'll say, oh, it's the Meiri, the new Meiri. It's not the new Meiri. Everything that was happening in just these basic works are all in the past 100 years. So the question really is it any earlier? Could we pinpoint it to a better time and stuff like that? So number one is like this. In the 1631, an interesting work called Novelis Chachma came out from someone who was known as Reb Yashar, Reb Yosef Canada, whatever. That's I'll just break my teeth and say his name wrong. But anyways, Reb Yosef Shlomo Reifa, otherwise known as Yashar. Anyway, this person, it seems, he was a scientist also, a doctor, and a tremendous Talmud Chacham. He was expert in Kabbalah, and he's a very interesting person. A lot has been written about him, what type of person he was, but we're not going to go into that. He has an introduction to one of his works, and in this introduction, basically, he says, he's talking about 1631, is where are all these works that we hear about that the Rishonim are quoting, or he must be referring to more likely the Beis Yosef and stuff like that. For example, we heard that there's a Rabbeinu Chananel. Where is it? Rabbeinu Gershom Meragayla, where is his stuff? Where is his materials? Ramesha Hadarshan that Rashi always brings down, where is his stuff? The Rimagash that the Rambam writes so amazing about him, where's the Rimagash's Torah? And the Sefer HaYashar of Rabbeinu Tam, the Ravid, the Ramban, the Ritva, and he has a whole list. Where are all these Svarim? And basically you see that in 1631 he's referring to, and it's a fact, in the 1630s there wasn't so many Svarim out there, but they knew of a lot of them. Okay, so that's Nakuda number one. Shlomo Zalman Hevlin brings down this passage in one of his articles where he talks about the new Rishonim that are coming out. Okay, so now I'm telling you a quote from the 1630s, and it's true. We know if we look in what went on in the 1630s, there's not so much happening with as far as Rishonim go on. So in an article that was written by Yisrael Tashma, he basically, the question that he was looking into was, when do Rishonim on the Talmud, I mean to say he's very concerned with, we're not talking about philosophical works on Chumash, we're talking about Perushim on the Talmud, when do they start coming to print? Specifically, is his concern is Ritva, Rashba, Ramban, Ra'ah, Shit and Gobetzes. These are the Svarim that interest him, because there was Rashi, there's Taisus, and what he's looking for, to link them all together, Chachmei Svarad. Now there was a Ran, so people had the quotes, some quotes of Ramban, Rashba, Ritva in these Svarim. The Beis Yosef had a vast library. He has Tshuvas Rashba. So the Gedolim heard of these people, but they didn't have the whole Chiburim. So, and as I said, I gave one example, and this is one of hundreds of examples that one could give, by the fact that the Gedolim were relying on a Ran in Hilchos Rosh Chodesh of Kriyas HaTorah, and they didn't have the whole Ramban. It's a game changer. Once you have the whole Ramban, you see it was 5 times the amount, it more information about the whole sugya. So it's very important if one could have the whole Rishonim if they exist. So when does this happen? So Tashma basically does a whole investigation, and he basically shows that somewhere around 1715 different printers start publishing, and there was no like group together that people decided to do it. Printers who were looking to make some money started printing different works of Rishonim, which they had. How they had it, manuscripts, that's its own discussion. And slowly, they start coming out from 1715 onwards. He makes a chart, and he basically lists out when the different materials came out. And he shows that's pretty much from the 1715 till let's say about 1800, you see a lot more Rishonim are coming on the market. Okay, this is step number one. So based on this article, and Chaim Soloveitchik also, after reading this article, came to the same conclusions. You're seeing that it wasn't that someone went ahead and actively, with a thought to do something about this, made a machon, so to speak, machon meiser of Cook in those years, and decided to put them all out. But slowly printers did, and if you start looking back over a period of 75 years, you could see that a lot of Rishonim that were never available before are available. So now, but the next question is, obviously, the only answer is this is the Yad Hashem was behind this. But now the question is, okay, so there's Svarim out there, but who's using it? Is anyone using it? And if they're using it, is there any changes in the method of learning? Because now we have a ton of new material from imagine someone found a whole new base medrash that they never found today, that they never knew about today, and all of a sudden Rishonim start coming out from there. It could be, we know Torah is endless and in depth, maybe something else can. So the answer is yes. Tashman, a different series of articles where he starts dealing with the Gedolei Achronim, such as the Pnei Yehoshua, shows that the Pnei Yehoshua, which when does he start coming out? From 1739 and onwards. The Pnei Yehoshua is a unique sefer, and we're not going to go into barichos why it's so unique, but suffice it to say, ever since it's printed many times, at least in the first 100 years, it's like the go-to sefer in any Masechta that he wrote. Till today, the kashas are still legendary. Some people, this is dependent on debate, how much people use the terutzim, how much people break their heads on a Pnei Yehoshua, but it's still a sefer that's known. It's a standard gift that people get, and it's found in most people's houses and shuls. And now, is there something unique about this sefer? So Tashma points to that this is the first time that someone is actually using as far as the Achreinim of that period of time, the Chachmei Svara that are just coming out in that period of time. He traces it a little bit, and the Pnei Yehoshua specifically mentions it. More recently, a fellow wrote a master's on this topic. His name is Yeshua Meyerson. And the master's was printed in a kaivetz that comes out from Lakewood called Kaivetz Chitzig Yibayim, Volume 11. I could send the article. It's a 50, 60-page article. In general, it's a fascinating article, more not so much about what we're talking about now. It's about the Pnei Yeshua's method. But he also shows, he went to check the Ritva, the Ra, and the Rashba that to show how many times he's using it. For example, in Kedushin, he quotes the Ritva 102 times. The Rashba, he quotes in Gittin 133 times, I believe it is. Anyway, the point is that, and now the Pnei Yehoshua becomes one of the Gedolei Svarim, and so too, you could start seeing, now no one really mapped out to see how much each Achron is using from this period of time, all the Rishonim on the market, but from the fact that we see that the Svarim remained in print a lot, and more Svarim are coming out, it seems like printers didn't just print Lishma, they printed because there was a demand for it, just like today. So therefore, what's assumed is that this was the start. Once the Pnei Yehoshua becomes a classic sefer, and not only him, if you go a little further, the Nesivos, which we actually did a whole episode about and we didn't yet release, he also, if you look through his farm, he's using all the new Rishonim that are on the market at the time. The Ksais also, as Chaim Soloveitchik already shows, that the Ksais, the fact that he's using the base medrash it's called the base medrash Sfard of the Ramban, it's obvious throughout his work. He had all these things, and he had a lot of this, and he's using it, and this is what's changing the Mahalach HaLimud of the 1700s that eventually lead the mid 1700s and onwards, that eventually leads up to the Mahalach HaLimud known in the yeshiva world as of Reb Chaim. But that's not for now. But the significance is here we see that the Mahalach HaLimud is getting a change because of new materials being used. Now, what's significant is that the Pnei Yehoshua did care about halacha, but as I just threw out, the Nesivos is a halacha dika sefer, even though he's writing on Shas. So he's using these new Rishonim, no problem. Okay. Now, but the question is, does the story go any further than this? So the answer is yes. And the Chayei Adam, who's basically becomes the classic go-to sefer for the next, let's say, from when it's published till the Mishnah Berurah comes out, even for some after the Mishnah Berurah. Let's look at some lines that he says. So,
perhaps just from a historical perspective, let the audience know. Pnei Yehoshua lived from when to when, and Chayei Adam is a much later time. Just because the Sefer we mentioned also was much later. So Pnei Yehoshua lived like from.
So basically, I'm not giving the exact dates. The 1756 is the last volume of the Pnei Yehoshua after his death comes out. So 1756 gets us what the Pnei Yehoshua, let's say, would be the closing of the Pnei Yehoshua works, and he's already nifter a few years earlier. And the Chayei Adam is getting us already in the early 1800s. So, and the Nesivos is a parallel period of time to the Chayei Adam. So we're seeing that already from, let's say, if we're mapping at 1739 is when the Pnei Yehoshua is starting to use these works. So I would say it's from, let's say, 1715 is when it starts being printed. By 1739, one of the Gedolei Achronim, the Gadol Hadar of his time, which was the Pnei Yehoshua, he's using it, and then we could see from there on it's being quoted. Now, to pinpoint, let's say the Rabbi Yehuda, he's definitely using it. How much? It has not been checked out. The Shagas Aryeh on some level. Other Gedolim, it needs to be checked more. But I did check is the Nesivos, which is around this period of time. Also, it's getting us they're basically they're active. They're what's called the connecting dar after the Pnei Yehoshua. So it's getting us already that Gedolim in the late 1700s, which would, let's say, to be safe, 1780s, they're using these Sfarim already, and ad halacha l'maisa, such as the Chayei Adam also. Now,
I just checked.
Yeah,
the Pnei Yehoshua was born in 1680 and he died in 1756, like you mentioned.
Right.
And then the Nesivos and the Chayei Adam were the next generation.
Right.
Rabbi Yehuda after that.
No, the Rabbi Yehuda is
following.
before. Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Yehuda dies 1792, but he's already publishing 1776 as Rabbi Yehuda of Chelik Aleph, so he's already using it over there. You could see that he's already using
I meant he's after the Pnei Yehoshua.
Right. He's a contemporary. He's a younger contemporary of the Pnei Yehoshua more. That's how it works. But the point is that by the time you get to the Nesivos and the Chayei Adam, who are contemporaries, so I want to just show what happens over here, and that will be one example. The Chayei Adam, in the shar of the first edition of a sefer, he already discusses what's the significance of a sefer. So amongst the things he says, you're going to see there's many chidushei dinim shematza hamachaber, meaning to himself, besifrei rishonim shaloi nizgal ha'arata, that were not known up till now. You open up, he has two introductions. So he says like this. He says, Hashem was zikeni Hashem limtzei b'sifrei rishonim asher yagati b'hem u'motzasi v'yinela me'inei ha'beiseisev ha'achronim sheloi haya b'yadam eisen ha'srarim v'anachnu zachinu lahem. So he got some new rishonim that were coming out, and he's using them la'alacha. Then he says again, Harb chibarti chibur mechibur gedolei rishonim asher lo nimtzei tzal hakol v'yushalmi v'teseftu lefam nimtzei gan svar chadashes v'lo yizeh sheyimtzei chidushim b'chibur. Then he says, V'ani matzasi b'shar mechaber rishonim achronim ki baruch Hashem hayetachas yadi sifrei rishonim l'roiv. I had a lot of rishonim, and throughout the work you could see a list needs to be made complete, but we see him using rishonim right and left. Just to quote one place, this is in his Chachmas Adam. At one point he says he's talking about a prisha, a taz, a prisha. He says they say what they say. Mishum shaloi ro divrei ritva elu shaloi nitbas b'yamehem. If they would have seen the Ritva that was published, that I have, says the Chayei Adam, that he just made a whole big thing how that he had it. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, the Chayei Adam in his introduction throws out that he likes the Eliyahu Rabbah, which is published much earlier and even earlier than the Pnei Yehoshua. The Eliyahu Rabbah is published in 1717 because he says like this: "Kusefer nechmad machma shahaya lefanav kol sefer rishonim v'gam kisvei yad harba." He had access. He had kisvei yad. And that we have to define more about in a moment. A parallel person besides the Nesivos that into Chayei Adam is the Shulchan Aruch Harav. He's also active and writing those years. He writes, even the Taz and the Magen Avraham didn't have them. Balil may sefer shitun kubetes al kama mesechtes yoytz by lezois vada ein lismoich lahakal lemayis al kula shnimtze b'divei achronim, because if they would have had the rishonim, they would have changed their halacha. And the Baal Tanya and there's a sefer that collects all these types of klalim, pulls out from the Baal Tanya, incredible sefer. He shows that the Baal Tanya says this in a few other places. So what we're seeing here already is that for halachadika purposes, a chibur like the Baal Tanya in Shulchan Aruch Harav, the Chayei Adam, the Nesivos, and really the Pnei Yehoshua also, because the Pnei Yehoshua does have a Dagesh Halacha, but that's not for now. They're using the new Rishonim. No, they're not complaining about it, and they're saying one could use it. Okay, but but the question is, as I said, I mentioned just now, Eliyahu Rabbah Eliyahu Rabbah is before this, and he had a lot of Sfarim, but it's a manuscript. And the question really is that these Rishonim that the publishers are printing, let's say I'm putting it in a certain date, and then I'm saying the Pnei Yehoshua used it, but where did they get it from? And then the question really, which I would like to conclude with today, is how does this get further? Is there a way to get it all over Europe? So the answer is like this. In general, one has to understand is that manuscripts are floating around Europe, even though the printing press has been invented well before this period of time. What happens is like this. We have an unrelated field, Kabbalah, comes from a Yid known as, a lot of Kabbalah comes from the Arizal.
There were no Chinese auctions or auctions in those days, like Gunazim selling manuscript?
Good. Yes. You do what we want to do, advertisement for the upcoming Gnazim catalog of whatever. Yeah. Now,
if anybody's out there, there's a fascinating mug in Avram for like $50,000.
No,
you
it's much
send
less.
They brought a present.
Yeah.
It did a doctorate on that. So
if
wants
someone wants
to,
to buy a present, yes, I'll appreciate it. Yes, correct. That's cute. Okay, now, basically is, so the Arizal, he dies in 1572. He doesn't publish anything. The printing press exists already at this time. Now, how do people start learning about Tyrus Arizal? Reb Chaim Vital doesn't go ahead and go right after he dies, writes it down, and prints it. As a matter of fact, he doesn't want anyone to touch it. What happens is, slowly, people start copying the notes. People that learned in Brisk know all about this type of thing. Briskers are very anti-publishing the stuff, but notebooks pass around from different versions of the years before. In the beginning of this man, a lot of people go ahead and they make a photocopy of someone's notes, and this is what they learn. They have the notes of the Shiurim. So the Arizal's material for hundreds of years. Even today, they're still discovering new chiburim of the Arizal that was known that existed because of new manuscripts.
Here we go for inside personal Brisker notes. This is how you take notes in Brisker on your lap.
Yes. The Arizal, all this material is floating around Europe for hundreds of years in what? In manuscript. That's an interesting thing. And as I said, it's for even in our day, new works you can find in different auction houses how they auction off different chiburim of manuscripts of the Arizal that were written by top Talmidim even, etc., etc. Now, all this was mapped out by Yosef Avivi, Rabbi Yosef Avivi, an incredible work where he maps out the history of the manuscripts of the Arizal, how they had it. So what was happening was like this. People would copy, for personal copies, they would be sending to other countries, to other places, and this is how they learned it, through manuscripts, even though the printing press existed. Why is this so? The reason is very simple. Because it was expensive to publish. So for personal use, you do it yourself or you hire someone to do it, professional copiers, and the professional copiers will copy the manuscripts of the Arizal. So manuscripts are floating all over Europe, even though, as I said, the printing press is all over. Fine. Now, but the question is like this. So there's manuscripts. So what happens? So I believe, possibly, a clue that someone that threw me down this path was a line that I saw from Betzalel Landau that he wrote, but he didn't embellish on it, and I think this is really what he meant. One of the most fascinating figures of Jewish history in the past few hundred years was the Chidah. He's born in 1724 in Yerushalayim, and he dies in 1807 in Livorno, Italy. He learns by his father and other Gedolim, and including Derech a little bit even. Okay, he's one of the most prolific writers who wrote on an extremely wide range of subjects from every area of Yiddishkeit, whether it's Chumash, Nach, Shas, Chuvas, Halacha, Drush, Kabbalah, Musar, Klalim, and bibliography. He authored over 60 works. Not all were printed in his lifetime, and some still exist in unpublished manuscripts till today. What's even more fascinating about him is he wrote a lot of this while he was traveling, because he spent a lot of time as he was traveling, because he was a shluach for the city of Hebron in Eretz Yisrael. The story of Shluchei Eretz Yisrael is its own discussion, which Avram Yari mapped out in his massive work on the subject. Now, a work of the Chidah, which he's less known for, which will actually answer up our discussion, is his travel diary. The travel diary is known as the Magal Tov. It's a diary of sorts of his travels of Europe and elsewhere, which was only printed in full for the first time in 1934 by Aaron Freiman. Part of this work was printed at the end of the 19th century. In 1879, another part. Because it was printed in all different places, even in English. This year was the year of the Chidah. It's been published 3 different times. Just this week, the third edition. One edition came out was from Chona Ma'ar. Another edition was with beautiful pictures and maps and all types of things from a fellow Raviv. And just this week went on sale for the first time. Rabbi Mandelbaum of Bnei Brak put out an edition of the Magal Tov, and all 3 of these editions are fascinating. They all have valuable information of the Magal Tov of his travels. Now, what happens is when you look at these travel diaries, one could see many different observations of the Jewish communities of the time. We learn about all the different people he met. L'mashal, we just spoke about the Pnei Yehoshua. He talks about the Pnei Yehoshua, Malach Hashem Tzvaka, how he met him and everything, and he discusses a fascinating conversation he had with him. But not only does it talk about the communities he visited and people he spoke with, we learn about a lot of areas about the Jewish book. Part of this was that he literally kept record of everything he saw. When he would go to places, he would ask to see libraries, he would see private collections, and he would mark down everything he saw. So here we have someone who traveled Europe. He visited over 100 communities over a period of his first trip. He was 29 years old, from 1753 to 1758. His second trip was from 1773 to 1778. He ends up staying in Italy, but he was everywhere. He was in many places in Europe. Italy, Amsterdam, Paris, and he sees everything in all these places. Some people let him stay by them a little bit, and he writes notes. He collected in his notes, in his notebooks, things that he saw. He also had a crazy memory. So he was collecting data that he's seeing traveling all over Europe. This was something unheard of in those days. And so now, so in his Magal Tov, which he only publishes, which he doesn't even publish, and it's not clear if he ever wanted to publish, there's a lot of this information. But he does publish a ton of the information of what he saw. And what's that? That work is called the Shem HaGedolim. This basically is the unparalleled, there's no work ever been published that equals to this work, which is a book where he lists out all the Gedolim and all the Sfarim. And a lot of times he could say in 2 sentences what he thinks about the Gadol, what's the rate about the Gadol. It's unbelievable what he says in this work. And he also, what's important is he's listing all the works, telling you, let's say I quoted a piece from 1631 from Yashar who's saying, where are these works? All of a sudden we're getting the answer where they are. They're housed in different places. And if you have the Magal Tov today, that's how today people have, when they're not sure about a work, they'll say, by the way, you want to know something? The Chidah, he saw this work already. And then they'll show you, the Chidah brings it down in this place of a sefer, in this sefer. L'mashal, a sefer of his that created a Mapecha and Halacha is his Birkei Yosef and Machzik Bracha. One of the things, this is a thorough sefer on Archaim Yerdea. What is one of the things he does? He was quoting tons of Rishonim, Tshuvas of different Gedolim and everything in the Sefer. So we're getting now what's being housed in these collections. Let's say I mentioned Eliyahu Rabbah had a collection. Different people had collections. They didn't have money to publish these things. There was no Meister of Cook, Mechon Yerushalayim, Avet Shalom out there. But he's seeing everything. And then he documents it in this Shem HaGedolim, and he publishes in his lifetime, and people start seeing it. So this helps create, and then he publishes Birkei Yosef, and becomes a very chashuv a sefer. And all of a sudden people start seeing, there's manuscripts. And then it becomes more and more known that not every work was lost. And then slowly, people start working. Now, Rome wasn't built as we know, Rome wasn't built in one day. It takes a lot of time. And now the Chidah was conscious of all this. And as I've quoted in the series that we deal with the Sfarim on each Masechta, a lot of Masechtas he'll list. On this Masechta is these Rishonim. You're like, look, and if people in those days, they didn't know where it was. But if you ask the Chidah says, what do you mean? It's here, it's there. You could do it. And slowly people that knew him started publishing works. We could link some of the people that published the first works of certain Rishonim. They knew about it through him. His name is in a lot of Sfarim. Till today, you'll see an introduction. How do we know that this manuscript is really the Ritva? The Chidah saw it. Sometimes he signed it. Sometimes he owned it. He also owned a lot of Sfarim going around. Anyway, the point is, he goes around everywhere, and his touring of Europe to hundreds of cities and places and speaking to people. This was like the person, because there was no news, there was no internet or a forum that you put up the information looking for Ritva, and then the next minute you get, like today, let's say someone wants to find out if there's a manuscript of the Ritva. He's learning a piece of Ritva, and he sees that a sentence doesn't make sense. So it used to be, what do you have to do? You call up a friend that lives in Eretz Yisrael, and you'd say, I'll pay you whatever amount of money, go to Hebrew University, order up the book. It's a whole long process, a few day process, till they bring it to you. You got to know how to use the microfilm, how to read it, etc., etc. Today, you type in 5 seconds in Google, it links you right to many of these manuscripts. You could download it to your computer in minutes. Now, you might have a problem reading these ancient handwritings, but it's seconds. Now, but in the 1700s, no one knew this. What happens? You have one person who went traveling everywhere, Shliach Eretz Yisrael, known as the Chidah. And this is how there are fancy terms, I would say, in the non-Jewish world of how things get spread and famous through different things. So he would be the person that helped get out there, so to speak, chas v'shalom to say such a thing, but like he would be what we used in the L'David episode, where we were saying when we spoke about how someone put on Twitter and it got all over a whole song. Once it was online, it went viral. So the Chidah, so to speak, through his Shem HaGedolim, slowly made it that people now knew these works exist, and they start publishing it. Okay, now just to be Messiah, one last point with the Chidah, and then one other Nakuda, which is as follows: the Chidah, he knows this the whole time, and so Lamashal, in his Shem HaGedolim, in the entry where he's talking about the Sefer Aguda, he says as follows. If you look in the Rishonim and the Mechaber HaKadmonim, Kedusha Rishonim Asher B'Chazdei Elyon Nitfasuk Mehem B'Doros Elu, that's starting to be published in his time, you'll find a lot of times things that it'll help you understand the sugya much better. He goes on, he says, if you look in the source and in the Rishonim as they're published, a lot of times it's kedai to look inside, because looking inside helps one understand the context, which is what I brought out from one example with the Ramban and Hilchos Kriyas Torah. In another place, he says that many kashas fall off if you look at it inside and you see the context. And he also says that some people didn't realize. They later on, people start asking questions on other Achreidim and say, what do you mean? You don't know there's a Ritva? And he says, no, they didn't know. The Ritva wasn't published. That Achron might not have had the Ritva because he wasn't alive at the time when it's being published. So even though the Ritva is way earlier, but he didn't always have it. So a lot of times this information can also be found in the Chidah, and he's telling you this. He says, another sentence relating to all this. ובדברי ראשונים נמצאים מצי חבילויס תשובויס לרבנן באסטרוי הן לעניין שקל וטריה והן לעניין דינה בגלל נגלוי סברס הראשונים גדול לעולם הפך סברס האחרונים. One could see unbelievable jewels and fascinating material ad halacha lemaisa from these new Rishonim that are being published, the Rishonim on Shas and the Shitim Gebetzis, which is what we're saying is what happened with the Pnei Yehoshua, the Chayei Adam later on, etc., etc. Now, there's an obvious question, which we will get to more, is how does everyone agree with this aspect of halacha lemaisa? But the point is, the Chidah held that this even has impact ad halacha lemaisa. As I said, now today the Chayei Adam held like this, and the Shulchan Harav held like this. Now, obviously, it needs to be defined clearly, klalim, and how this works, which Rishonim and stuff like that. And we will discuss a little bit more about this later on. Now, just to conclude, one last nakuda, and that is as follows. Now that I'm pinpointing it, that by the time the Chidah dies and his sefer starts getting more famous, so even from Italy, it's getting more published, it's getting more recognition. He wrote a lot of svarim, and he's constantly talking about this. And the Shem HaGedolim is becoming also known. This is what I'm claiming is somewhat of a spark that got people more interested in it. Now, so what happens? So we could already see this is in the late 1790s. This is while the Chidah is already alive. Stuff come out. Last week I mentioned some works of Gainim that are starting to come out. If you look, so the question is, which work? Is there a specific work that comes out from manuscript with a pirish that starts that type of stuff? So last week we mentioned the Heimek Shela. The Heimek Shela, the Netziv, is 1861 and onwards. Is anything else coming out at that time or earlier? So if we start at the same time as the Netziv, there's a Sefer Shari Simcha from Rabbeinu Yitzchak ibn Gaius, one of the Gedolei Rishonim. This work, the Rishonim didn't, the Beis Yosef did not have. It comes out from Rav Bamberger with an intense pirush. Also, the same years as the Netziv, he puts it out in 1862, 1861, 1862. So you see another Gadol working on an early work, and he wrote a beautiful chibur called Meah Sha'arim, Rabbi Yitzchak Bamberger. And as Askamas Gedolim, and he got a hold of it from Manuscript, and he also publishes it. So Mamish, you can't. It's not even that the Hemach Sheila had influence on him; he's working on it at the same time as the Netziv. If you go back, also the Itur comes out. The Itur, it seems, was published in the 1500s, but it wasn't the whole Itur. And in the late 1800s, the Itur comes out from Manuscript. Now, in the Askama of the person who publishes it, he writes, he goes to Ramar Trettinger, who we spoke about at length in the episodes where we spoke about the machine matzah controversy. So he writes that he knows the Yeshuas Yaakov saw the Itur, which is getting us to the Yeshuas Yaakov dies in 1839. So he saw the Itur. It seems there was a plan to publish the Itur, but it didn't come through. So when does it come out? Later on, in the 1850s, 1860s is when it starts. Another example, Lamaisa, this Itur was floating around the manuscript. Rabbi Ephraim Zal Margolis quoted in his works on Yeridea that goes to print in the late 1700s. This seems to be the same Itur that was floating around because it's published in Galicia, the Yeshua Yaakov, and in Lemberg, and the Ephraim Zal Margolis and Brodt. It seems to be they saw this Itur. I don't know who owned it. Maybe Ephraim Zal wanted to buy it. It doesn't sound like he owned it, although he owned many manuscripts. The Sefer Yasha we point to is 1800s, is early 1800s, also from a Gadol. Now there was a Yid, Rabbi Eliezer Lowy, tremendous gain. Time does not allow us to discuss him barichos, but he also prints a work on the Gaonic work Mekach Memka, which we quoted last week. Also, he publishes that work of his in 1800. Where he's taking this much earlier than the Netziv, but his pirish, I would not call it a thorough pirish, it's just Makairis, but at least he has ha'aris here and there. It's definitely useful, and the fact is that he's learning a gain on some level, but it's not doing with the Hemach Sheila, because the Hemach Sheila is mamish pages and pages, which ends up with Reb Sadi Gain, which we quoted today with Rechon Fisher Perlau, who does that even more. Anyway, bottom line is that for today, the takeaway is that we're trying now to pinpoint that this thing that we're seeing, Reb Chaim Kanievsky and the Mishnah Berurah being famous for, it's not just the Meiri, it's many Rishonim, it's not just in the 1800s, it already starts from in the 1700s. By the time you get to the Pnei Yehoshua, which we mentioned his work starts coming out in 1739, he's already using these materials. We've linked it to the Chayei Adam, the Nesivos, Shulchan Harav, and the Eliyahu Rabbah a little earlier, and it's being used. And then to conclude, we mentioned barichos, that the Chidah seems to be, if I needed to point it on someone that helped get it out there, and he now people know it's in different collections, I would give a lot of credit to the Chidah and his works. Okay, now just to be Messiah, what's left for us to do is, and this I hope to do in the next episode, is Lamaisa, is there, besides, we mentioned over the past few episodes, some Yechidim, they took upon themselves to start printing Sfarim, and they printed them. Was there any like Mechon Yerushalayim type project or a company or something that tries to do this on a bigger scale? So we'll talk a little bit about that, and that will get us to pretty much closer to the conclusion of the series of the manuscripts. We'll just, after we deal with that, we will discuss, but briefly, the story of, up till now, we're discussing manuscripts of Sifrei Halacha, of Rishonim and Gaonim. What about Chumash? What about Midrashim, Midrashi Halacha, which Reb Chaim Kanievsky is also using all this. We discussed this already in season 1. Is this related to this? And we will also discuss what the usage of manuscripts for Gemara. And then through all this, we'll get to see what the Chazon Ish really holds about all this, why he was against it, and that's how we'll conclude a few episodes about this topic.
Thank you, Rabbi Dr. Brodt. Fascinating. So many different ideas and so many different openings into the lives and the works of different Rishonim and Achronim. Really, each one of these could be their own segments. But thank you very much, and we hope to continue in the very near future. Have a wonderful day.